I'm Mrs. Orlando. I teach psychology here at East, all levels. I think the ongoing definition for mental illness is that it's a condition that involves some change in your thinking, your emotions, or your behaviors and relationships. And so it's sort of this issue of having abnormal thoughts or feelings or behaviors. Now, what makes it an illness versus just individual difference really has to do with how it impacts you. And so we generally say that for people with mental illness, it has gotten in the way of their ability to function in some way, or it has caused them significant distress or impairment in their life. But there are a lot of different types, varying in severity levels. So I think for adolescents specifically, it's important to learn about mental illness because for a lot of the disorders that we're going to learn about in psych and a lot of the disorders that people experience, many of them start during adolescence. So what we call the age of onset, like when you begin to really sort of start to see symptoms, generally for many of them starts in adolescence. I think in terms of stigmas, I think a lot of times the two that really stand out to me the most is that if you have a mental illness, you're dangerous, which is the exception, more so than the rule. It's not very common that somebody with a mental illness is dangerous. And I also think that often you hear that, you know, it's your fault or this is just a phase and you need to suck it up and just deal with it. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Almost implying that, you know, it's something that's within your control. And I think that that's a problem because many of the mental illnesses that people struggle with are biologically based. It's a genetic predisposition. It's something, the chemicals in your brain or the way that your neurons fire isn't accurate. And so I think that when you have the stigma that it's a weakness or a willpower issue, I think that that's really dangerous and prevents people from getting the help they need. Education is really important. I think learning about what the disorders are and what the disorders are not, and the symptoms that go along with those disorders, I think is really important. I think just talking about it, you know, being willing to share that you have struggled or that you've had certain thoughts or that you have a family member or a friend, you know, and just sort of engaging in those conversations, I think is important. And I think the more that people begin to realize that it's not just a willpower issue, that there's really something perhaps more to it, then I think you'll find people willing to seek treatment. You know, they've talked a lot about, you know, they use the analogy, you know, if your doctor told you that you had diabetes, you know, you take your insulin to treat it, right? And a lot of times that same thinking doesn't apply with mental illness. A lot of times people think that they just need to be stronger or they just need to change their thinking, and they don't realize that in the same way that heart disease or diabetes are biologically based, that a lot of these mental disorders are biologically based. I think it depends on what your disorder is, and what you and your doctor decide. You know, for a lot of people, there's some evidence that for certain anxiety disorders and mood disorders, there's some evidence that therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, can be as effective as certain medications, but that depends on the severity of the symptoms. And it kind of depends. So I think one of the things to know about most of the medications is that they don't cure the disorder, they treat the symptoms. And so combining both is often, you know, even if your doctor thinks that the medication is going to work well for you, there's nothing wrong with other therapies.